In March of 1967, a Cuban fighter pilot watched the jet flying beside him cease to exist. Not crash, not fall, not disappear from radar. Cease to exist. In the open sky and in front of his eyes. His voice shouting those words over the radio was recorded in real time by an American listening post less than 200 miles away. Hours later, an order came down from Washington. Reclassify the incident. Seize every tape. Send everything to headquarters. And in the official record, the destruction of a supersonic combat aircraft was reduced to 3 words: equipment, malfunction. This is the story of those 3 words, and of the men who knew they were not true. The first thing you need to understand about this story is where it comes from. It does not come from a witness who walked into a newspaper office. It does not come from a deathbed confession or a blurry photograph or a man with a story to sell. It comes from inside the most secretive intelligence agency in the United States, the National Security Agency, the NSA, an organization so classified that for decades, the American government would not officially admit it existed. People who worked there joked that the initials stood for no such agency. The NSA does not investigate flying objects. That has never been its job. Its job is to listen, to intercept the communications of foreign militaries, to break their codes, to know what they are saying to each other in real time every hour of every day. And in March of 1967, the NSA was listening very carefully to one place in particular: Cuba. 5 years earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been, before or since. American intelligence had learned in the hardest way possible that it could not afford to miss anything happening on that island. So it didn't. Every radar sweep, every radio call, every transmission between Cuban pilots and their ground controllers was being captured, recorded, and analyzed by American listening posts ringing the Caribbean, which means that what happened next was not witnessed by one nervous pilot. It was witnessed by the United States intelligence community, through its own equipment, on its own tapes. It was a clear day in March. Cuban air defense radar picked up an object approaching the island from the northeast at high altitude. It was not responding to identification signals. It was not following any known flight corridor. It was heading toward Cuban airspace, and nobody knew what it was. The response was standard procedure, the same procedure used by every air force on Earth. 2 MiG-21 interceptors were scrambled to meet it. Understand what a MiG-21 was in 1967. This was not an old aircraft. It was one of the most advanced interceptors in the world, the pride of Soviet aviation, capable of flying at more than twice the speed of sound. Cuba's MiGs were flown by pilots trained in the Soviet system, guided from the ground by Soviet-built radar, armed with live missiles. The 2 jets climbed, the ground controller guided them toward the target. The American listening post, far away, recorded every word. The lead pilot reported visual contact. He described the object as a bright metallic sphere, no wings, no tail, no visible engines, no markings of any nation. The ground controller ordered the flight to attempt visual identification, and then, when the object did not respond, the order escalated. Arm weapons, prepare to fire. The lead pilot radioed that his weapons were armed, that he had radar lock, that he was preparing to engage, and then, seconds later, the second pilot, the wingman, began to scream. This is the moment everything in this story turns on. The wingman's voice, captured on American tape, shouting to his ground controller that the lead aircraft had broken apart in the air, that it had disintegrated, his leader's jet in pieces, falling toward the sea. No missile fired, no explosion seen, no enemy aircraft anywhere on radar. One moment the MiG was there, locked on, ready to fire. The next moment it was wreckage. The object, the sphere, did not linger. According to the account, it accelerated and climbed, departing Cuban airspace at a speed and altitude the radar operators could barely track, heading south toward South America, and gone. Now stop. Because I want you to think about what the men in that American listening post had just heard. They had just recorded a Cuban combat aircraft being destroyed in flight by something with no wings, no weapon signature, and no nationality. They had heard the wingman's voice. They had the radar tracks. This was not a story someone told them. This was raw signals. Intelligence, the most trusted form of evidence the intelligence world has. Standard procedure for an event like this is unambiguous. A foreign military aircraft destroyed under unexplained circumstances is a critical intelligence event. It gets written up. It gets reported up the chain. It gets analyzed by every relevant desk. And at first, that is exactly what began to happen. The Intercept operators logged the event. A report was prepared describing what the tapes contained: an aircraft lost, cause unknown, object unidentified, and then the order arrived. According to the account of this incident that later surfaced, the order came from above the listening post, from the chain of command that ran back to Washington, and the order said three things. First, the incident was to be reclassified. Second, the cause of the MiG's loss was to be recorded as equipment malfunction. Third, every tape, every transcript, every scrap of data related to the event was to be packaged and shipped to Washington immediately. Equipment malfunction. I want to sit with those two words because they are doing an enormous amount of work. Equipment malfunction is what you write when a fuel pump fails, when a hydraulic line ruptures, when an engine flames out. It is the most boring phrase in aviation. It is designed to be boring. It closes the file, it ends the questions, and nobody ever asks about it again. But the men who wrote those words had heard the tape. They knew what the wingman had screamed. A fuel pump does not make an aircraft disintegrate in level flight. A hydraulic failure does not break a MiG into pieces in clear air while its pilot has weapons locked on an unidentified sphere. The phrase was not a conclusion drawn from the evidence. The phrase was a replacement for the evidence. And here's the detail that, to me, gives the whole game away. If the loss of that MiG truly was an equipment malfunction, a Cuban maintenance failure, a Soviet design flaw, then it was none of America's business. It would have been a minor note in a daily intelligence summary. You do not seize every tape and fly it to Washington for a fuel pump. You seize the tapes because of what is on them. Something on those recordings was important enough that the United States intelligence community wanted every copy in one place under its control immediately. That is not how an agency treats a malfunction. That is how it treats evidence. So how do we know any of this? If the tapes vanished into Washington and the file was stamped with a lie, how did this story ever reach the outside world? The answer involves a young researcher, a one-line slip in an official document, and a knock on the door from the FBI. In the late 1970s, a citizens group called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, CAUS, was doing something almost nobody else was doing at the time. They were not chasing lights in the sky. They were filing lawsuits, Freedom of Information Act requests, aimed directly at the agencies everyone assumed had nothing to hide: the CIA, the Air Force, and the NSA. The NSA fought back hard. When a federal court ordered the agency to at least account for its UFO-related records, the NSA acknowledged holding more than 150 documents that it refused to release, claiming their exposure would damage national security. A federal judge was shown the agency's justification, a justification so sensitive it was itself classified, and the judge sided with the NSA. The document stayed sealed. Think about that for a moment. An agency whose official position was that this subject did not matter went to federal court to keep its files on that subject locked away. But one researcher connected to this effort, a young man named Robert Todd, had been pulling on a different thread. Todd was, by every account, relentless. He filed hundreds of information requests, and somewhere in the flood of paperwork, he came across references to the Cuban incident. An account of the Intercept had circulated among former Air Force Security Service personnel, the very people who staffed the listening posts. Todd began asking official questions about it. He wrote to the government, citing what he had learned, asking for the records. And then the FBI came to his door. Todd was a private citizen. He had stolen nothing. He had simply asked, in writing, about an event from a decade earlier. And in response, federal agents visited him and read him the espionage statutes, the laws under which the United States prosecutes spies, laws that carry penalties up to and including death. He was warned, in effect, that continuing to pursue this specific story could be treated as a crime against the United States. A young man with a typewriter and a mailbox threatened with espionage law for asking about an equipment malfunction. Here's my first question for you, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments. If the official explanation was true, if a Cuban jet simply broke down and crashed in 1967, what in that file could possibly justify threatening an American citizen with the Espionage Act a decade later? I have never found a satisfying answer to that question, but it gets stranger, because years later the NSA itself confirmed that the story existed. In the 1990s, under continuing legal and political pressure, the NSA finally began releasing some of its long-withheld UFO records. Most of what emerged was mundane, intercept chatter, foreign press summaries, and the like, but among the released material was a document that referenced the 1967 Cuban incident directly. The document is heavily redacted, names blacked out, operational details blacked out. But the skeleton of the account I've just told you is there in an official NSA release. The Intercept, the Sphere, the Lost MiG, the Reaction. Let me be precise about what this document does and does not prove, because precision is the entire reason this channel exists. It does not prove that an unknown object destroyed a Cuban fighter jet. The document records what was reported through intelligence channels, and the original account came from personnel describing what they heard and handled. Memory can err. Second-hand accounts can grow in the telling. The original tapes, the actual primary evidence, have never been released, and without them, no one outside that system can verify what the wingman actually said. But the document does prove something. It proves the incident was real enough to generate classified records. It proves the NSA possessed material on this event and fought for years to keep it sealed. It proves that the story Robert Todd was threatened over was not a story he invented. And that leaves us with a very uncomfortable shape. A real event, real recordings, a real seizure of evidence, a real reclassification order, a real federal threat against the man who asked about it, and sitting on top of all of it, an official explanation, equipment malfunction, that the government's own behavior contradicts at every single step. Now, I owe you the other side, because there always is one, and a channel that hides it is not worth your trust. The skeptical reading of this case goes like this. The original detailed account came from former Air Force Security Service personnel, not from a document released at the time, and second-hand military stories are notoriously unreliable. The MiG-21, for all its speed, had a real accident record, and aircraft do occasionally suffer catastrophic structural failures that look from a distance like disintegration. The wingman was under extreme stress watching his leader die, and panicked radio calls are not measured testimony. As for the secrecy, intelligence agencies reflexively protect anything revealing their collection capabilities. The NSA might have sealed those files not to hide a sphere, but to hide how well it could hear Cuban military radio, which in 1967 was a genuine national secret. Even the FBI visit to Todd can be read this way. He was asking about signals, intelligence sources, and methods, the most protected category of secret in the entire American system. The reaction may have been about the listening, not about the object. That is a serious argument. Parts of it are almost certainly true. The NSA absolutely was protecting its methods, and a frightened pilot absolutely can misread a catastrophe. But notice what the skeptical reading cannot do. It cannot explain the lead pilot's own voice before the loss, calmly describing a metallic sphere with no wings and no tail. It cannot explain why the cause was not left as unknown, which protects sources just as well, but was instead actively rewritten into a specific, false-sounding mechanical explanation. An honest file says cause undetermined. This file, by the account of the men who handled it, was given an answer that the evidence on the tapes did not support. Protecting a method requires silence. It does not require a story. And that distinction, the difference between hiding information and replacing it, is what this entire case comes down to. Here's where I am supposed to tell you what really happened over Cuba in March of 1967. I am not going to do that because I do not know, and neither does anyone else outside of Walton, Washington. Maybe it was a catastrophic structural failure at the worst possible moment. Maybe it was something in that sky that we still have no name for. But I keep returning to the three words: equipment malfunction. Somewhere in 1967, a person sat at a desk and chose them. That person had access to the tapes. They knew what the wingman screamed. They knew what the lead pilot described in the final minute of his life. And with all of that in front of them, they wrote down a phrase they could not have believed, because it was the phrase that ended the questions. The pilot's name has never been released. Cuba has never acknowledged the loss. The tapes have never surfaced. The full file remains classified 59 years later for an aircraft that officially crashed because of a faulty part. A malfunction is not classified for 6 decades. A malfunction does not require the Espionage Act. A malfunction does not need every copy of the evidence gathered up and flown to headquarters. Whatever happened in that sky, the people who heard it happen did not treat it like a malfunction. They treated it like a secret. And the file is still sealed. This is the silent archive. We read the full record. We follow the actual language. And we do not tell you what to think. Here's my last question for you. When an explanation contradicts the behavior of the people who wrote it, which one do you believe? The words or the actions? Leave your answer below. I read every comment. The files are waiting.